So tonight's lineup. Tonight at the Active Travel Cafe, we will start as usual with our crowdsourced news update. So we'll have 10 or 15 minutes or so where you can share any news, things happening near you, or if you want to raise something that is happening, sort of a national or even international piece of news, then please do flag it in that first section. Our speaker tonight, following that, is Holly Weir, who's an urban planner and researcher, and she's going to talk about her work on children's travel and mobility. And I think she's also going to tell us a little bit about some research on car dependency that she's been doing. So on that note, we will move to our news section. And does anyone have anything to share? Something that's been happening near you this week or nationwide? Robin.
Yes, so I'll put a shout out first for the Safe Streets Now events, which are happening on Saturday. I'm not sure if anyone from Better Streets for Birmingham is on at the moment or yet. But we've got our one organised in Oxford from 11 till 12, and there's probably quite a few people here who'll probably give a wave or something in a minute. And most of them are going to take the format of some kind of gathering of people between 11 and 12 at somewhere that's associated with road danger, followed by a minute's silence at 12. And really it's a protest against dangerous driving. We're really making the point it's dangerous roads as well as dangerous driving. That's me.
Yeah, thank you, Robin. And I think no doubt somebody will put it in the chat, but yeah, the website safestreetsnow.co.uk I think possibly has details of where protests are taking place. Mark, you got a hand up.
Thanks. Sorry, I haven't made the earlier two. I've been busy and having Jewish holidays. In fact, yesterday was Yom Kippur. So those of us who are involved with things, we're doing things. So good and bad news from Brighton. We've had a fantastic critical mass. I saw somebody said one about Manchester. I can't find a link to the video, but we had about 300 people going round and round, almost too long. And there were kids crying because it was too long, because it was too safe and the parents wanted to keep going. But it was really good. But faced with a council that is at best doing very little, and as worst rowing back on things, it's very necessary that we're doing things. So Brighton has gone from, hopefully doing lots of stuff to in a sort of critical state. So we'll have to see what happens. And just a slight comment on from a personal point of view, we're delivering LTM 120 training for Institute of Highway Engineers. So if you do know a council that's interested in getting their staff trained up, then they could sign up. And we're doing the next one we got is in October, and it's fully booked up. Mostly seems to be people from Suffolk and Cumbria there. So if there's anyone here and they want, and they can tell me what their councils are like, I'd be interested. But there are other people there as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. That does sound good. And I'm going to, if you don't mind hanging on a second, I'm going to bring Alison in because I think she's going to talk about the critical mass.
Yeah, I'm having kind of talked to Saskia Helchers and Sally earlier. I'll just give a quick update from the UK-wide critical mass events. We think there were 37 in the UK over the last couple of weekends, and there's, I think, 4 coming up next weekend, 4 or 5. Stockport, Derby, Leicester, East Grinstead, and somewhere else next weekend. But we reckon in total, well, we've got a total of 2,700 participants at the moment, but we haven't got figures for Glasgow and Manchester. So it will be over 3,000, undoubtedly, with extras next weekend as well. We've heard big numbers in Brighton, very, very impressive numbers in Guildford. We have 279 in Guildford. Estimates of about 400 in London. People might upgrade that. But basically just tons and tons of rides, far more than the previous one, kind of growing every time, and really amazing to see. And yeah, just if you haven't, which most of you will have done, I'm sure, check out the hashtag on Twitter, because there's some amazing photos and videos of kids and their families and communities having fun. And I've just spotted Saskia appearing, so I don't know if she wants to add anything to that.
Oh, she's disappeared again. Maybe she'll be back. Thank you, Alison. Yeah, I mean, I went on to the sort of Newcastle and the North Tyneside rides at the weekend, and it's just really lovely to see, and it's really great to meet lots of new families that you don't know, who kind of share the same feelings about it and want things to change, and I think it's really nice to see it growing, and huge amounts of work well done to everybody who's been involved, because it is a lot of work. And I look forward to next year's. H. Can't hear you. Sorry.
That's got it. It's all right. I'm trying to run you off the Android. Catch up on the end of Alison's bit there. We are getting a burgeoning number of bike buses, but I don't know whether she's been in touch with bike buses around the country. This is sort of kids cycling to school. I'm finding they're popping up at every nook and cranny in Glasgow. So we had a good coverage of it as well on the media. I'm just reflecting. Northern are doing a consultation for Northern ears about the new trains they're going to get to replace the DMUs, and I think it's a good. They're talking about flexible space, but not really mentioning bikes. So I think we need to sort of put the oar in for Northern and ScotRail, who are looking at hybrid trains and trains to replace the diesel units, which are more environmentally friendly and most of the time compatible, that operate like the ones in Anglia, with level floor boarding, and they can be diesel or electric. So if there is a consultation, sorry, Robin, diesel multiple units or diesel electric multiple units if you lived in Hastings. Basically consultation, what we're going to order, and we're recommending certain things. Make sure we put the oar in for good flexible space, loading lots of bikes.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's kind of good to flag, and perhaps we should invite, I know that Cycling UK often get involved in those discussions, perhaps we should invite them on to talk about that, whether they are, what they're doing around that, working with rail operators. And that comment, bike buses, we have actually got somebody coming from Worcester coming to talk to us about bike bus, how to set up a bike bus later in October. So that's one to watch out for if it's something that anyone's interested in doing. Jo.
Okay, so as you know, Sally, there's been a bit of a controversy over the past few weeks in Newcastle due to the removal of an LTN right at the end of an experimental traffic order process. The data that's in Fenham, well, it's actually two LTNs, but the local authority is treating them as one, which is disingenuous of them, because they're using statistics from one LTN to justify the removal of the other. Now, that's quite interesting. The reaction to it has been quite interesting, because I think it's really demonstrated just how much local authorities sometimes are kind of affected by strong public reactions. Basically, there seems to have been a strong public reaction at a single consultation event, as a result of which the local authority, having talked about putting these particular measures in place for at least 10 years, very, very quickly took fright, and, with very, very little warning, something like 4 days warning, took them out again. And obviously the reaction, because we happen to be kind of pretty well organised in our area, the reaction was from the residents who were in support of the measures was immediate and quite strong. And I don't think they were expecting that. So we're having meetings with councillors set up. We've had one meeting with local councillors already. We've got a meeting to be arranged with the cabinet member for transport. And I think that the plus side of it is it's just sort of spurred off this discussion in the local area into our relationship between where we travel and the kind of towns and cities that we want. And I think it has spurred a bit more of an interest in active travel and sustainable travel. And I think we have demonstrated to the council that while there may be people who are vehemently against any efforts to control motorised transport, there are also those who want to see safer streets, and we'll carry on plugging that.
Thank you, Joe. Yeah, and I think it's what's very sad about what's happened in Femina was really partly it's a response to what's happened in another part of the city where there's been an enormous backlash in Jesmond. And I wonder if that hadn't happened, whether Fenham would probably just have gone through and none of this would have happened. But it's a real shame. They seem to be sticking with Jesmond, but who knows? But yes, and I mean, I always say to people, if you want to make campaigners, then you do some kind of action like that. You close the street, put in a cycle lane. You'll suddenly all these people come out the woodwork who think it's wonderful, not just the people who don't like it. So yeah, it'll be an interesting one to watch. Has anybody else got anything that they want to raise? No, we're all very quiet this week.
Yes, sorry, I do. Sorry about that.
Oh, is that Adam? No, Eddie.
Eddie, yeah. Just I don't know if people know there's national protests this weekend in a number of cities, organised by an organisation called Safer Streets Now. I don't know if I'm allowed to talk about things like protests. It's about
somebody did mention it right at the very beginning, but
sorry, I missed the very start.
If somebody can, I don't know if someone's done this already. If somebody could put a link in for people to find out more, that would be in the chat. That would be really great.
I'll do that now. Okay.
Ali, I've just realised, hearing a Liverpool accent, there was an event. There was a car-free day event in Liverpool at the weekend, which apparently went really well. So I'd be interested to hear from if Eddie was there. But also just make a comment about the lack of car-free day events across the country that anyone seemed to organise. There seemed to be hardly any. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, given how poor some of them were in the past, but it's gone really out of fashion.
Yeah, I actually did go to the one in Liverpool, and it was pretty good. Yeah, I mean, it was kind of from around 9 o'clock in the morning till about 4 o'clock. There's a lot of it was in a park, called Wavertree Park, and it was I spoke to one of the people who organised it. I'm in the Merseyside Cycling Campaign, and it was one of our members organised it, because she's in a group in Wavertree called Love Wavertree, and they organised. They had sort of some cycling organisations and some, but yeah, they also had other things just for people to turn up, to make it like a family event in the park, and it went all right. Yeah, it went okay. The weather held, and yeah, people seem to enjoy it. But what she did say is there's a lot of bureaucracy in organising anything. She needed to fill in, like spending hours filling in forms to do with the council permits and park permits and temporary event notices because you're selling food and things like that. So that might be one of the reasons people are a bit reluctant to do them. I mean, they didn't actually close any streets off.
Yeah, it's a shame. I think really, and I don't know whether that's what you're driving at, Mark. I think local authorities should be doing these things, and because it is. I mean, even organising the Kiddickle mass rides is fairly, and for especially if you're in a city centre, you do have to do all that organising.
Well, that's exactly what I meant, and the fact that it's actually part of European Mobility Week. I'm just wondering how many councils felt, because it was European Mobility Week, they didn't want to get him into a minefield of European stuff happening, so decided it wasn't going to do it. Liverpool Council did one last year, which went very badly, and they lost £40,000, and it was all over the papers recently that actually that isn't that much money in the scheme of things, but they just made a real terrible pig's ear of it.
Yeah, it's a sort of risk averse.
Mm.
Tim, I'll bring you in, and then I think we'll move on to Holly.
Yeah, it's just on the same point, really. It's cycle to school week this week around our way. We're doing the Kiddickle Mass. The Kiddickle Mass group have got £300 from Leicester City Council to support that. Andy from Leicester's on the call. The other bit is that once a month, through the last Sunday of each month through the summer, May to October, is open streets, which used to close streets to vehicles, but it's a city centre. It's organised by the City Council cycling team, and there are themed events on and activities around cycling and mobility in the city centre once a month. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Tim. Great. And on that, we'll move to our speaker section now. And I'm really, really pleased to have Holly Weir here, who I met, I think, probably around 4 or 5 years ago at a conference about child-friendly cities, and has done some very interesting research on children and children's sort of mobility, travel, and is also an urban planner. And she's going to talk to us about her research this evening, and I'll just hand over to you, Holly. You want to?
Well, thank you. Yep. Yeah, thanks for having me, everyone, and nice to see you all here. I'm going to talk a bit about healthy, active and child-friendly places. As Sally said, I'm an urban planner by background, but spent the last few years doing some research and a PhD on child-friendly neighbourhoods. So today I'm going to focus on a couple of projects I've worked on, but mostly on my PhD research. But I'm also going to link it into a project I was working on last year at Queen's University in Belfast on car dependency in Belfast, just because I thought that would be sort of a nice link. And yeah, my PhD was done at Westminster University, so now known as the Active Travel Academy, with Rachel Aldred and co. And yeah, just I always start with this quote, just to remind people, I'm sure you're all interested in children, certainly from hearing the news, it sounds like you are, but you know, the people who need a bit of convincing, then this is about making places better for everyone, basically. And it's always a good way of framing that, I think. And certainly with children, actually, because there's a lot of overlap with older people in terms of their needs and things, which I'll touch upon throughout this talk as well. And yeah, I guess one of the reasons why I wanted to make this link as well to the project I worked on in Belfast is because actually my start point from my research on children's neighbourhoods or children in their neighbourhoods wasn't actually active travel. I guess my start point was like children's independent mobility. So I was interested in exploring why that had been reducing quite significantly in recent years in the UK as well as across the world, really. Yes, I was coming at it from an urban planning point of view, really looking at how children use their neighbourhoods, a little bit for travel and getting around, but mainly for play, and just looking at sort of how widely they roamed, really. But actually, as the work progressed, I kind of saw that there's a really strong link between how children are getting around and active travel and use of cars. And these statistics just sort of give an insight into that. So the figures on the left, you can see, that the proportion of children travelling home alone from school has gone down massively in recent years. But actually, I'd argue that linked to that is surely like this increase in children travelling to school by car. Because of course, unlike us, children can't be independent if they're in a car. They need to therefore be with a parent. So aside from the obvious negatives of car travel, particularly for children, that means that they can't have that autonomy or independence either. So yeah, before I go on, I just wanted you all to go to this link in Slido and just start to respond to a couple of questions on there. I'm just going to try and swap my screen over, but if you can just use that code, so it's 1378779, and then I'll swap over now. Hang on. Okay, so I just wanted you to think about what factors influence if a child walks, cycles, scoots, skips, really whatever, to school. And again, these might be obvious answers for some of you, but just be good to get a bit of insight into what people think are kind of the key factors that influence this. And yeah, while you're thinking about that, I guess, I'm aware that school trips are like very well researched, and we know a lot about children's school trips, and it's kind of frustrated me a little bit, but it is one of those things that's quite easy to measure as well, because it is something that the vast majority of children do. So yeah, here we've got infrastructure, distance to school. There's a few things on safety and parental perceptions of safety or parents. Traffic, friends, good routes, demographics, physical ability, what friends are doing, So I guess, this is some of these things I think will be picked up in my talk in a mo, but I think what's coming through here is there's certainly an awareness in this group, but it's not just about the infrastructure. And that's one of the things I want to kind of pick up on, that, there's issues around safety and perceptions of safety, but also like friends and who children have got to go with and things as well. So it's just kind of, let's keep thinking about that wider piece. And then just a second question now on what influences if a child walks, cycles or scoots to their sports club. Is there anything different? Are there any different factors you think, aside from maybe those things you've just identified for school, or is it kind of the same stuff? And again, this is just something I've put in here because it really winds me up, where people drive their children to football half a mile down the road. I mean, the same as school, but I wonder if there's some different factors that affect that as well. So yeah, parents is definitely coming through strongly here for sure. Cycle parking, distance, which is perhaps kind of a key thing we can pick up on later as well. I think, we're aware, for example, that primary schools are often located in sort of every neighbourhood and in relatively close distance if you choose to go to one that's close. Sports clubs maybe not always the case. So I think distance is maybe more significant here. And again, we've got like friends to travel with, time of day, equipment needed is definitely a key one in this instance. Somewhere to park, darkness, maturity and safe routes. So yeah, that's really great. If you want to keep on typing, feel free to. We can come back to this at the end, I think, as well. I'll just carry on for now with the rest of the talk. Okay, so I'm going to just introduce my PhD research, which I call the Child Friendly Neighbourhoods Project. This was done in Hackney in East London, which is where I was living at the time. So it's a high population density area. It's also got quite high levels of deprivation, fairly high proportion of young people, and although maybe not high enough, compared to other parts of the UK, quite a high proportion of children walking to school at 65%. And I'm not going to talk loads about the methods, but you're welcome to ask me about these later. But I mean, it was quite a small scale study. It was child-centered in the sense that I just talked to the children directly via their schools, but all the data I collected was from what the children told me. So I didn't talk very much to their parents or their teachers. It was all about what the children said. But it was mostly qualitative. One of the main methods I used was go-along interviews, which is where I walked and talked with the children and they led me around their neighbourhoods. And that was a really great way to sort of get some in-depth insights from them. And I worked with 17 children from 3 different schools in Hackney, all slightly different demographics. And they were all in school year 5, which is age 9 and 10. And just some of the top level findings initially was there was high levels of active travel in the cohort I was working with in their class cohorts. So 79% of them walked to school, so higher than the average for Hackney even. Minimal car usage for neighbourhood journeys. Wasn't much cycling, but there was a lot of walking. So most of their journeys were being done on foot, walking around. And I'd argue that because of that, they had a really good understanding and knowledge of their neighbourhoods. There was mixed levels of independence. Some of them were travelling alone, not all of them though, but they all felt like they were in control of their trips because they were often they knew where to go, they knew their neighbourhoods. So I'd say they had high levels of autonomy, even when they were with an adult. And they had concerns over safety, but interestingly, it was mostly related to people, not cars. That could be linked to some of the crime figures and there's various issues with media hype and things in terms of issues around safety in Hackney in particular. Some of it based on truth, but not all. But yeah, they didn't really worry about the threat of cars on the roads, which is interesting. And I'm just going to talk through this a little bit. So I guess what I was trying to get at through some of those questions in the Slido as well is that, my background is urban planning. So I kind of my initial focus was on the spaces that children were using. Obviously, as I progressed through the work, I saw that it's not really just about the space. The space and the infrastructure is like one part of the influence on what they do. Actually, permissions and motivations are really important too. So permissions could be parental permission, as people have kind of noted in those questions there, or it could be societal permission. It could be like no ball game signs, which is effectively removing permission to want to use a space. And then motivation around like whether there's other children to play with. Does it look like a space they want to use? Do they have a connection to nature that's going to inspire them to use that? And I think all of this links to like sort of social cultural influences and social norms, which we'll come on to a bit more at the end as well. But for now, I'm just going to talk you through sort of these three key elements of space that I thought was really important and came out strongly, and that I think are particularly relevant to children's journeys. So I picked out these third places, these three types of space. And I guess in active travel, the obvious ones are these transitory spaces, basically the footways, the roads, the paths between places. But of course, you're not going to use those if you don't have a nice place to start and somewhere to go at the end. And this, again, links really strongly to research done with older people as well. In fact, I stole this concept from an existing study done on older people, and they identified these third places and these three types. So I think, again, important to know when we're trying to argue the case for this, it's not just better for children, it's better for everyone. And these are just some examples of the spaces that the children had to use in the research that I did in Hackney. And I guess, as you can see from these images, they're by no means perfect spaces. But it's just kind of some examples of what worked and actually what didn't. So these were the spaces that the children had outside their front doors. And again, I think it's about having a space that feels safe, but like I said, also that they feel permitted and motivated to use. So, for example, this road at the top left, it was a quiet road, very well traffic calmed. So the boys who lived there used that road a lot to play out on. And some of that was because it was a quiet, safe road, but it was also because their parents encouraged them to use it, they permitted them to use it. And because they lived next door to each other, they had a friend to go with too, so they were motivated to use it. Whereas this middle space at the bottom, okay, it's rubbish quality play space, but it is a play space. It's kind of giving a signal that it's okay to play in theory, but the girl who lived there, she never went and played on that space. Because it probably was too overlooked. There's an argument that you need some overlooking, but this was like, there was no sort of security there. It was very well overlooked. There was no one to play with. She didn't have friends that lived there, and her mum wasn't that keen on her going out either. So I guess these spaces are really important, but they can't sort of work on their own. It needs all these other things to function alongside them. But I definitely say when we're planning neighbourhoods and things, the key thing is that we need to have these spaces outside the front door that encourage people, and particularly children, to then go and use their neighbourhoods further. And then the transitory spaces, kind of the obvious ones, really, sort of the paths, the footways, pavements between places. And again, I know these don't necessarily look amazing, but they did work for the children in the study. Even when there was a relatively busy road, as long as they had a pavement and a crossing point, they felt pretty safe like using it, and they were quite happy using it. Of course, I'm not saying that would be the case in all places or all situations. Again, I think this is, London has high levels of walking and cycling. There's still improvements to be made, but walking was fairly normative for the children. It was just the thing they did. So as long as they had a footpath or a crossing point, they were happy to do that. It may be, in other locations, we need to think harder about it. And also, I think it's sort of maybe take it as for granted sometimes that there would be a footpath. But I know lots of places near me where there aren't any footpaths at all. So, it's just maybe just having at least that in the first instance is a start point for encouraging walking. And then, of course, you need somewhere to go. And for the children, I guess these two images at the top are like their local corner shops. And these were a really key part of their explorations of their neighbourhoods and their sort of initial explorations, particularly when they were going out on their own without a parent. So having a corner shop in easy, safe walking distance was really important for them, and often a start point to them going a little bit further. This bottom image is one of their schools. And again, like we identified earlier in the Slido, having that in close proximity was really important. Somewhere that they could walk, it was in walking distance. If they then had pavements and safe crossing points to get there, they felt happy walking. There was one child, for example, where there was just one road where there was no crossing, and because of that, his mum insisted on walking with him. She didn't feel like she wanted him to go on his own. And that proximity thing is really key. So, like, for example, that's kind of why I asked about sports clubs, because they're often more dispersed, and there's definitely, we've got issues with funding for leisure, which seems like maybe nothing to do with active travel, but actually this is all part of a bigger system-wide issue, where if we've got, these things sort of very dispersed across our neighbourhoods, then that discourages active travel and pushes people into their cars. So everything in close proximity is the key, really. Coming back to this idea of space, permission, motivation, I've just kind of highlighted here this influence, this blob, which is social cultural influences, just to kind of really bring home that I think social norms were so important. So for the children in the study in London, walking was just part of their normal daily behaviour. They would just never think to get in the car to go to school. It would have probably been slower, and it just wasn't something they do. And so this last slide, I'm not going to talk loads about the project I worked on in Belfast, but I just wanted to touch upon it because it's just so opposing, I guess. So this project, it was led by Queen's University, and we were looking at trying to sort of map out the system of car dependency in Belfast and trying to understand what factors influence it. This was all being led by the fact that Northern Ireland and Belfast in particular has got really high levels of car use. It was part of the Centre for Public Health, so they had kind of a strong health focus, but it was by no means only really linked to that. I don't know how well you can see this diagram, but I guess what it highlights, even if you can't, is that it's complicated and there's a lot of things going on that can influence what people do and how they use and why they use their cars. And this was kind of what we saw here. I've just pulled out some basic stats. I've kind of put in density because I think that was a key difference between Hackney and Belfast. Belfast is quite sprawling, it's very low density, and more similar to maybe some of the other cities in the UK, certainly some of the towns at least. And then you can see how that impacts on proportion of children walking to school, and also just proportion of trips done by car. And also, though, I think what's interesting is if you look at the proportion of children walking to school, around half of the children in Belfast still live within a mile of their school, but still out of that cohort, half of them are going in the car. So it highlights that even because you've got that sort of car dependency, you've got that car orientated mindset, even when maybe the planning is okay, people still drive. And I mean, I now live in Suffolk, and I see that where I am. Like, it's just, even if you do have those things that you'd have in London, like you've got a pavement, you're in close proximity, people still drive. And so I guess what I kind of wanted to pull out of this was that unfortunately it's just harder to do, I think, where you've got places where they're already car dependent. Just putting in a slightly rubbish pavement, like some of those images I just showed for London, or like a ropey playground, just isn't going to cut it. It needs to be really high quality, and you need to really do sort of a package of measures to push people to change their behaviour. And this is certainly what we found in Belfast, where there was just people were just really fixed on this car orientated mindset. It was more convenient, it was cheaper, and there was just it really needed just one of these lines here to be cut and to sort of reset the cycle. Otherwise, the cycle just kept continuing, and we've got like these feedback loops here basically, which kind of show how that works. So yeah, I just wanted to finish up by saying that spaces are important, but it needs to link to understandings of human behaviour, to encourage changes in travel patterns. And I think it's just particularly important for children who really lose out in a car-dominated society, as I'm sure you all know, because that's where they also lose their independence, which of course is where my research all started. So yeah, thanks. Happy to take any questions. And there's a couple of articles on my work here as well, if you want to have a look. So thanks, guys.
Thanks, Holly. That was fantastic. Really interesting. And while people are thinking about questions, I think we have got a couple in the chat. I just wondered whether, because I think in my research, which is talking to people who grew up in the, well, I guess from the sort of 70s to 90s, that, you know, what you were talking about, things like corner shops and sports clubs. In fact, in their case, it was mainly things like swimming baths. It was really, really important that they were close. And it's not really something that I was looking at particularly. So it is quite interesting to hear you talking about that. And I wondered what you thought. It had made me think, what do you, what the sort of period that I've looked at in the post-war, we're talking about quite high density housing and huge numbers of children living in a relatively small area. And now I think we perhaps we are in many places, people are much more dispersed. So does that kind of traveling, that destination means friends too, doesn't it? And I think I was just thinking about what you're saying about that girl saying who wouldn't go and play in that area, she wouldn't have someone to play with either. Perhaps her friend lives somewhere else, and we talk about playing out in terms of relationships to our kind of immediate street or streets and neighborhood, but actually many children's friends live further away, don't they? And we don't really talk about how we join up playing out or playing or being out, you know, with friends, that the fact that you have to be able to get to them, and kind of all those many barriers to that, or kind of, you know, infrastructural or cultural, or I wonder whether that's something that come up in talking to the children that you were.
Yeah, well, I think I mean the schools that they went to, they were all schools with relatively small catchments, so in theory all their friends should have been close by. And with that girl in particular, her friend was close by, but neither of them were allowed to go to see each other without a parent accompanying them, which just completely restricted them doing that, basically. There was also sort of a road to cross that, yeah, again, you know, it was her mum just saying she wasn't comfortable with her crossing that road. So even where the children are nearby, you've obviously got all those issues around perceptions of safety and parental sort of fear that influence them. But also, yeah, I agree. I think we've kind of got, again, it's like this sort of vicious cycle, because children can now have friends further away, and, you know, parents will set up play dates and things, and it kind of feels okay for them to be seeing their friends that don't live nearby, and then they therefore don't get to know the children that are just maybe around the corner or something. So again, it's that cultural thing of just encouraging people to know who's nearby, because I mean, I'd imagine, yeah, certainly in most towns and cities, you know, there's lots, even in relatively low density, that certainly for play purposes, there's still you know, there's children around. It may be different when we consider other infrastructure and facilities and things that definitely in low density can end up being quite a lot more dispersed.
Yeah. We've got loads and loads of questions in the chat, so I'm just going to run through those. One is, does alone mean without parents, but it could be with friends?
Yeah, so yeah, I was careful about the wording, maybe not in the presentation, but yeah, alone means without an adult. Yeah, I mean, that's another thing. I think actually in some of the previous questioning around that, it has just said alone and it hasn't been sort of clearly defined, but I would define it as just without an adult, without a supervising adult, but with friends is fine. Because yeah, again, you wouldn't want to go completely alone. That's just completely different kettle of fish.
Somebody's asked, you said kids walked because there was a footway everywhere. Do you think they would cycle if there was a cycleway everywhere? i.e., are they or the environment choosing their modes?
Yeah, I think it depends on the distance, and I definitely think for the group of children I worked with, no. I think they were happy walking. The schools were close enough that it was fine to walk. So I think if there'd have been a cycleway there, they just still walked, basically. And walking was just a simple thing. You know, a lot of them some of them maybe had bikes that they would play with here and there, but they didn't use them frequently. Their parents didn't cycle, which was a barrier. So there's a lot of other sort of barriers to deal with for the cycling, whereas walking, I felt like that was an easier thing for them to do, and it's cheaper. It was less, certainly in London, you know, there's a high risk of bike theft and things, so it's just the easy option. So no, I don't think, in some instances there was bike routes, but yeah, it wasn't a big factor in their decision making around their mode.
Yeah. And somebody's asked, is space, permission, neighbourhood the three things that make child-friendly neighbourhoods, or that make kids play outdoors?
Space, permission,
neighbourhood.
Yeah, well, I guess, yeah, they need the space. Yeah, they need, well, yeah, I think it's space, permission, motivation. So they need that space there. They need to feel like they're allowed to do that, and then they need to want to do that. So having sort of a community or a neighbourhood around them is going to help support them with that. And yeah, like I said, I think, you know, depending on where you are, you may require more effort than other places. So if there's already lots of children playing out, it's sort of the norm, then that's going to be an easy thing probably for the children to want to go there. Whereas in places where it's sort of a new thing or not common, not only do you need to persuade the parents, you also need to persuade the children that they want to do that as well. But yeah, I think if you can get those sort of combo of those things working, it'd be successful.
Somebody's asked, were they making trips with a destination, or were they just playing?
It was a mix, and definitely there was also quite an obvious difference in socioeconomic status, I would say, in terms of what the children were doing. So those who were from sort of a lower socioeconomic background would be more likely to be playing out and doing some playing. Those from sort of the better off neighbourhood, most of their trips were to clubs and things. But yeah, there was some playing out happening, and yeah, sort of it was interesting because some of the data, I collected data in various ways. Like I got them to map where they were allowed to go, and then we did these walking tours where they sort of showed me where they went. You know, certainly like one boy, for example, was sort of over exaggerating on his map how far he could go. But once we did like the walk, sort of the go along interview, where we walked and talked, it was easier to get a sense of what was actually just a bit of just exaggerating a little bit and what was the actual reality. But there was definitely playing and things going on with some of them, yeah.
Interesting. And somebody has asked, what did you find at what age they got more independent mobility? 13, 15, 17, for example. But I guess you were talking to children, just in a younger children.
Yeah, so I taught the children I worked with were age 9 and 10, so that's year 5 at school. And I chose that age because in the UK, that does tend to be sort of the age where they gain more independence. And that seemed to be the case. But what was interesting was the influence of the school policies. And this is another thing that you know, you could bring in as one of those factors. So I worked with 3 different schools. 2 of them, well, one was very laid back about when the children could walk on their own. One sort of said, oh, you can do it in year 5. And then the other said you can't do it till year 6, which is actually quite common practice across schools. But, you know, it's just like it's a rule. We don't think it's appropriate till year 6. So all the children in that school where it wasn't allowed till year 6, none of them walked on their own to school. They did have a little bit of independence outside of the trip to school, but none of them were allowed to go on their own to school without an adult. At the same time, like as much as that winds me up, it didn't really affect they still were walking, they were still enjoying the trip. It didn't really bother them that much. But it is interesting how that can have such an influence. And I think, you know, I see that as a parent now that, you know, the school kind of make you sign your child's life away to say, oh, they can walk home on their own now. And you're like, you know, for me, I'm fine with it. But for a parent who worries, you know, that's just going to stress them out more, and particularly if they're telling you, no, it's not safe to do it till year 6. And yeah, I mean, I didn't track them further, but certainly now my own son's now in year 7 at secondary school. It seems like that in the UK now is definitely the time where they all go on their own. And I suppose it was interesting as well because it is, again, it's that sort of cycle, because if it needs to be everyone doing it. So, you know, I would have pushed my children when they were younger to go on their own, but they didn't want to because no one else was doing it. So again, but I think the school has a massive role in that and could really change behaviour.
Yeah, I think that is a good point. It's something that I spoke to the head of our local primary school about, because we've got a 2-tier and 3-tier in Newcastle. I'm sort of right in the middle. My children go to the 2-tier, but he'd come from a 3-tier school, a first school, and in the 3-tier schools they go from middle school, so that's beginning of year 5. They're expected to go on their own, and most of them seem to go on their own. And I've noted my neighbours who have got children who have been through the 3-tier system are much more do more with their friends earlier, because it's allowed earlier at school, and therefore it's sort of okay. And the parents obviously support, because they can't take children to first school and middle school at the same time, so they kind of have to. So, but yeah, I think that's interesting. It's something we don't really talk about, that influence of schools and that kind of, you know, how significant that is, you know, their approval.
Yeah, definitely.
Mark's got a hand up. I'll take your question, Mark, and then we'll return to the ones in the chat.
Sorry, that's fine. Actually, the school policy was going to be one of the questions, and I think that's really important. But I think the age does really matter. We've done a lot of work with schools and bikeability mapping, and it obviously changes really dramatically. But there's the schools as in terms of the parents, but there's also the governors and the whole attitude to the schools, and then the interaction. And obviously we're working in Hackney, doing a lot of work in Hackney. And I think the culture, because of the culture in Hackney, it's just really normalized. And I think that the sort of parents that wouldn't even be interested in their children cycling somewhere else will be completely normal about it in Hackney. So I think it's a really difficult question about that balance. And I'd love to look at your Belfast map in a bit more detail. It's really hard to see the detail. So some details would be, you know, where to look at that would be really good.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, I can share that. I've got a draft paper. I can share a link to that. You'll be able to see it on there as well, and a bit more discussion if you're interested. But yeah, I think it is interesting that those different perceptions as well. But again, even with bikeability, you know, I think it's like a standard that it's done in year 6. So it's this sort of assumption that you can't cycle on your own till year 6, basically. I mean, that's what you're telling parents by doing it at that age. Obviously, that's not your fault, but that's like a system thing, isn't it? Again, that's kind of coming through.
We trained my children in year 4, but I think the other factor is mapping, and mapping isn't child-centered. So we did some work in Camden or Islington, and we were looking at mapping of schools. We worked with, I think they were year 8s, and we had maps, standard street maps, and they were going, you know, what's that big thing, big blob you've got at the bottom end of the borough? And it was King's Cross Station, but they had no need to go to King's Cross Station. They never went to King's Cross or St Pancras. It wasn't in their remit of places to go. They were interested in as you say, the shops, their little shops. So having adult focused destinations on mapping means very little if you're trying to get child-centered mapping. Even the most obvious ones like big stations, you think, well, you must know where that is.
Yeah, definitely. You should put all the corner shops on the map.
And then you have kind of you know, many of those shops will have rules about numbers of children and not allowed in if you're in a uniform or so on. So yeah, it's a sort of wider societal support, isn't it, for children? Picking up on Belfast, somebody has asked what your conclusion on the reasons for car dependency on Belfast is. They say, I've been working there on and off recently, and also did around 12 years ago. I noticed a big difference as I'm looking at it through new active travel eyes. And I don't know who this was, sorry, because I'm reading them copied out, but I was thinking the traffic flows too well in the city centre, big, wide, one-way streets in a grid, urban freeways, etc., and the large rural catchment area.
Yeah, well, I think you've kind of picked up on like a number of the key points. Yeah, large catchment area. It's still, although people complain about the traffic, it's still way quicker to drive. It's a challenge to fund public transport improvements just because it is quite dispersed and it is quite low density. But I think there has been improvements. There's like a new glider, which is basically just a better quality bus. And I think that has started to change perceptions around public transport. But at the moment, the routes that it goes on are very limited. So it's not showing like a big mode shift, but I think it's demonstrated the potential of that. Yeah, and it's got it's sort of just major roads running through, as you know, have many cities. And just at the moment, you know, there is stuff in policy that's kind of trying to support a mode shift away from car use, but I think those other things are just so embedded that it's those policy things are just sitting in policy and not really getting delivered or put into sort of changes and actions. So it's definitely a challenging one. I mean, we did, as part of the project, there was a little sort of side piece on road user charging, and you know, there's a lot of evidence around that changing behaviours, and this is maybe an instance where starting to bring in a price of sort of increase the price of car use might start to change things, because that's probably the easiest thing to influence behaviour. But arguably that would sort of hit the poorest first, which so politically I'm not sure how that would sit. But yeah, sort of a lot of changes, and also issues, also a lack of awareness around what the benefits of not using a car are. And we did like a citizens jury at the end, which is basically like a 2-day deliberative workshop. And that was really interesting. We just had a small group of residents working with them, explaining all the issues. And they all came away like going, oh, I hadn't realised like how bad using a car is. So I think it's a bit of education as well, maybe for residents.
Yeah, we're not getting any of that, though, are we? From government really signalling that it's, you know, that they don't want people to do it, and that's and I suppose Belfast, I think, is possibly quite like Newcastle. It's really easy to park and drive. You know, people complain about the traffic, but actually, it's not that difficult to drive.
Yeah, I mean,
when you get there.
And I suppose one thing that stood out for me is I did some interviews with residents, and there was one guy who, he drove because it was quicker than all the other modes, and he had small children. And, you know, I'm sure you've all heard these arguments before, but he's like, you know, it's quicker to drive for me to drop my kids off at school and go to work. It's like saving me like an hour and a half a day. And I want to have that time with my children. So I'm not going to, he wasn't being like awful about it, but he's just like, you know, that's where I'm at, you know, like, and I suppose it's like you sort of, again, I think we have to see these things as a long-term shift as well, because obviously he's now set up his routine around that. He knows how much time he's got with his kids. And so, to tell him, oh, you've got 2 hours less every day, isn't going to go down well. But if, you know, someone else in 10 years' time will be in a very different place and things. So I think we have to see these as long-term things. We can't expect people to change necessarily overnight, but obviously that requires strong governance to be able to do that, which we often don't have.
Yeah, absolutely. Tim, do you want to come in? And then I think we have one more question in the chat that I can see.
Thank you. I was just thinking about Belfast and sort of religious education, really, that there are Catholic schools, there are Protestant schools, and then there are not, you know, mixed non-faith-based schools. And living here in Leicester, we have a couple of designated Catholic primaries, and the parking and traffic at school run is a nightmare for people who live around them. But it's because the catchment is so huge and people are coming from a wide area to drop their kids at school. It's not the neighbourhood school, it is a school, but it's a particular faith-based. So I think there's that element in Belfast of, you know, crossing different patches of turf, like presumably postcodes in Haringey or Hackney and so on, and sometimes here in Leicester. But I think that will also have played into how, you know, how that's working. Did you find that? Was that an issue? Did you?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. So in terms of the school catchments and the different faiths, that was definitely an issue at secondary school, at least, where it was just, you know, people would be travelling quite long distances. So for sure that was having an impact. Interestingly, sort of in terms of like any sort of historic issues with safety and things, people didn't talk about that much, or it didn't seem to come up as strongly as I'd expected, not having ever really been to or experienced Belfast before. So sort of in my naivety, I thought that would be a big deal, but But I think maybe underlying it is there sort of in terms of, you know, people are not wanting to go to certain parts of the city, and there's certainly some segregation and things. But yeah, I think the school catchment thing it's obviously heightened in somewhere like Belfast, or where you've got those differences. But I think again that's, you know, a thing across all schools, where if we open it up to say you can go to any school, you know, it doesn't matter what the distance is, then, you know, again, I see where I am now, like there's people are selecting like a school in the town down the road. It's like, well, why would you do that? But they're allowed to do it. So I think that's another sort of part of the system that could make a difference to how children get to school.
Yeah, we're kind of just unraveling so many things which are either kind of planning related or education related, or, you know, that are being kind of, it's so hard to change those things, isn't it, that are kind of built into the system and to people's lives. And Adam, you got a question?
Yeah, it was just more Bath has quite a large selection of private schools, so, and you can really see the traffic difference. I was just wondering if there was a sort of a deprivation aspect to any of your work where you saw that there was higher levels of walking and cycling in certain areas, or is it just more that whether or not it was a proximity thing to the school?
Yeah, I just saw it based on proximity, but I guess, yeah, in terms of my own study, you know, I picked the 3 schools, so I didn't speak to children that had maybe got filtered out and gone to a private school miles away. So the children I was speaking to had chosen to go to the state schools with a small catchment. But yeah, that's definitely an influence as well, I think. And certainly, yeah, I mean, it maybe would have played out again at secondary school, where I think people start to then think a bit more selectively about where they're going to go. But yeah, I didn't track the children through that route to see what happened.
Yeah, and that actually kind of ties in with another question that's come up in the chat. Somebody says parents are clearly key in terms of the big structural decisions they make, e.g. to send them children to a better school far away, and in terms of micro decisions each day. Is there much research, or do you have plans to look at parents' perceived and real barriers? I'm thinking house prices to average salary ratio, e.g. people have to live far away from services, increase ability to make school choice, stranger danger, fear, etc. I guess there is that kind of, you know, parents, when they're making those decisions, are not thinking about children's mobility.
Yeah, well, again, I think it's like maybe it's a role for like new housing developments to play or something, when they're sort of bringing new residents into an area, you know, encouraging them to get the children to go to the school that's close to home, or realizing the benefits of that. Because I think, yeah, there is a massive role that parents play. Most parents don't think about it. They just think, oh, that's a nice house. We'll live there. And then, you know, maybe they're looking at school catchment if they're bothered about the particular school, but they're not necessarily thinking, oh, it'd be beneficial if my child can walk to school when he's 11 or something, especially if they're already in sort of that zone of driving the children to school when they're younger. So I think certainly sort of some parental education at some point, but again, you know, something that even the primary schools could do to encourage parents to think about how their children are going to get to secondary school that doesn't require driving, for example, could be something. So yeah,
it's more just like we need to kind of create an aspiration for that, rather than at the minute it always feels like we're telling people they should do because it's good for, you know, it feels a sort of, I don't know, it feels sometimes the messaging can be, I think, come across as a bit worthy, rather than being something actually that people would aspire to for their children, because actually I don't know how we change that kind of.
Yeah, well, and also I think, isn't it about like making parents' lives easier? I mean, that's to be honest, that's probably where I started all this from as well. It was like, well, if I can leave my children outside to play on their own or go to school on their own, that's just like way easier for me as a parent. You know, and we chose where we live now partly on the basis of the fact that, yeah, they could get to school easily, and there was no way I was going to like live in a village where I had to drive them to school every day, apart from all the various reasons, just purely from a selfish, like, easiness reason. It's like, it's not going to do it. So yeah, it's like, I don't know. Yeah, it's funny. But I think it's maybe just trying to change like how we talk to people. I mean, I suppose through my research, it's always, particularly the stuff in Belfast, it was like really important to think, just try and understand people's point of view and like work out, with this guy who said, well, I'm going to lose time if I don't drive. Okay, well, he's not going to change. If we build an amazing cycle route or something, he's still going to drive. So we need to address that issue or that perception in his mind to support him to change his behaviour.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think if there aren't any more questions, we'll bring it to a close. But thank you so much, Holly, for coming and sharing that with us. That was really, really fascinating presentation and really great discussion. And we hope you'll come and join us again. And if you are able to share your slides, we can put them onto the website, and the recording should be available sometime within the next week. So we'll share that as well.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think if nobody else has anything to share before we go, we'll finish for today. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And next week, we've got Tom Bailey, who's going to talk to us from Streets Systems, who's going to talk to us about some of the work he's been doing with Transport for Greater Manchester on bus stop bypasses and technology to enable visually impaired and blind people to use bus stop bypasses safely. And I think we have Mark, aka Ranty Heimerman, next week as well. Am I right, Mark? I think you're here, aren't you? You remind me, I should have written that down. I've got my list in front of me.
Yes, Sally, sorry, reaching for my microphone. Yep, see you next week.
With subject to be announced. So watch out on Twitter and on the email, we will announce that. So thanks very much, everybody, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Bye.